Hello, I'm Wayne Willis. I'm a professor of education at Morehead State University in Kentucky, and I'm making this little video introduction to existential thought for my graduate students in philosophy of education. And what we're looking at is some major themes in existential literature and how they relate specifically to education. And this will just be the first little clip, and then hopefully there'll be more later. Uh, to talk about existentialism is in some ways to violate one of the principles of existentialism. It's a movement that puts a huge emphasis on individualism, and existential thinkers tend not to like labels and categories, and I think there's something fundamentally false about those. And so Roger Shen, as a writer many years ago, wrote that anybody who claims to be an existentialist isn't, because to like the label is to violate the principle. And of course, we really can't talk about these ideas without using some labels. So we just acknowledge up front that we're sort of violating the principle of existentialism by talking about it in these ways, but we're going to do it anyway. Um, there are several themes I want to mention that come up a lot in existential thought. One is the idea that life is suffering. Existential thought tends not to focus on a kind of Pollyanna view of the world, that we can just make everything right and fix everything. In terms of education, we shouldn't necessarily protect kids from all of the negativity out there. We should help them to cope with it and deal with it. Learning to face and deal with suffering is a basic part of life. Another theme is that life is not fair. Traditionally in schools, we've often taught kids that if you live right and work hard and play by the rules, everything will go well for you, that life has a basic fairness about it. And the existentialists say that's just not so, and we shouldn't be perpetuating falsehoods like that. Now, given the fact that life involves suffering and is sometimes not fair, the reality, though, is that we as individuals are free to choose how we will respond to those unfairnesses of life, the things that are painful in life. We're free to respond to the good things. We are ultimately free to choose how we will respond to whatever life sends our way. And so along with that is the idea that therefore we're responsible for our own choices, our own responses. We can't really blame ourselves on somebody else. If you say, this terrible thing happened to me and it was their fault, well, I think the existentialist response will be, well, life's not fair. Congratulations, you're grown up now. You can accept the fact that life's not fair. Now, what you're going to do about your situation? What are you going to do that is in your control about the situation? You can choose to respond one way or another, but you're ultimately free to choose. And however you choose is your responsibility. You can't blame anybody else on that. The one thing you can't choose to do is to not choose. To not choose is to choose. One of the most compelling essays that explores this kind of idea was Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. Viktor Frankl was a Jewish medical doctor who was captured by the Nazis and World War II, and spent a great deal of time in Nazi concentration camps. He lost all of his family, all his possessions and everything. And there were numerous times in there where it seemed to be just sheer accident that he got in the line that was going to work rather than the line that was going to the gas chambers. But as a medical doctor and thinker, he observed life in those concentration camps and reached some pretty compelling conclusions. One is that even though outwardly you have no freedom in a concentration camp, you don't get to decide, when you'll go to work, where you'll go to work. You don't get to decide when you'll eat or what you'll eat. You don't get to decide when or where you'll go to the bathroom. You don't get to decide anything about your life outwardly. And one might think that in such an environment where there's no freedom, everybody would be pretty much alike. But what he found was that despite that lack of freedom, there was enormous diversity in the concentration camp among people based on how they responded to the situation. And he said there were some people who just killed themselves, and there were some people who just went crazy, and there were some people who laughed and made jokes all the time, and some people who smoked all the time. And there was just an infinite variety in the ways people coped with the lack of outward freedom. And he said ultimately what that shows is there's an inward freedom that you always have about how you will respond to what life sends your way. But again, because you're free, you're responsible. You can't blame your life on somebody else. As a kid, you may be able to say, well, mama made me do this, or daddy made me do this, or a teacher made me do that. But once you're an adult, if you're in reasonably good health, you have infinite choices about how you will respond to things. And sometimes we would prefer not to. We'd prefer to blame somebody else. We'll sit around and moan and groan about things that we can't control instead of celebrating the things that we can control. Another book that I think about when I consider existential thought is a self-help book by M. Scott Peck called The Road Less Traveled. He was a psychiatrist. When he wrote that book, he was a Northeastern Ivy League trained psychiatrist. But when he wrote the book, he was fairly strongly identifying with Buddhism. Later, he converted to Christianity, a rather conservative version of Christianity. But throughout that book, he explores this idea of taking responsibility for your own life instead of blaming your situation on somebody else. And it's very, very easy to simply complain about the situation rather than to accept responsibility for your responses and move ahead. And so if this idea is interesting to you, I found that to be a very compelling book and one that I would recommend. So the first point is life is suffering. The second point is that life is not fair. The third point is that we are free to choose how we will respond to whatever life throws our way. The fourth point is that we're responsible for our own choices because we're free. And then the fifth is that individuals are alienated from themselves by the highly complex, sophisticated, technological, bureaucratic world in which we live. That is, a lot of the things that we call progress, technology, bureaucracy, actually make it harder to be ourselves. And we find ourselves in a situation where we don't even know ourselves. We don't know who we are and what our lives are about. And again, those things we call progress are actually sometimes inhibitors of a real quality of life. Just give an example of this, but when my grandfather was alive and he worked on a farm, in a small farm in South Arkansas, and raised his kids during the Great Depression, and they never had a great deal of money. But he had a great deal of control over his life as a farmer. He decided when to plant and what to plant. He worked the clock as he deemed appropriate to get the work done and so forth. There wasn't a lot of people outside of him telling him how to live his life and to do his work. A generation later, my dad worked at a factory, at a paper mill. And at the paper mill, you have bosses who tell you everything. Do this. And I worked at that paper mill for a while, and it was quite an education for me. Made me want to go to college, for one thing. But there was one job I had. I was working on the top of the pulp mill, which is where they cook wood chips into pulp to make wood. And there are these great big cookers. They're 3 stories high, and there's a man on the top of those cookers, and it runs about a 20-minute cycle, and every 20 minutes he goes over and opens the top and turns some valves to empty them, and then closes those valves and opens some more valves to refill, and he does all that, and then puts it all back together and goes and sits down for 20 minutes. And he just does this every 20 minutes. And as an 18-year-old, I watched it and I thought, man, this guy has a cushy job. This is great. All he has to do is sit here, and every 20 minutes go run through this little cycle and go sit down. But later on, I came to realize that would not be, for me, a very satisfying way to work. It would be unbelievably tedious, meaningless. And I had a job while I was there actually watching a machine to keep somebody from sabotaging it. And they set me on a stool and said, you sit here for 8 hours, and if anybody throws anything on this machine, you make sure you see what they look like. And again, I thought, well, that sounds like an easy job to sit here for 8 hours. But that's a pretty miserable way to live. You can't read, you can't do anything else but sit and look. And so while that wasn't hard work, it was not nearly as meaningful as farming my grandfather did, not nearly as satisfying in a lot of ways. And so, yeah, we use machines to make life easier, but it doesn't necessarily make it more satisfying or more meaningful. When you work at the paper mill, you don't really see the outcome of your work. You don't walk out with rolls of paper in your pocket. You go, you punch the clock, you do this one little piece, and then at the end of the day, whether or not you made any paper, you don't know. That's something at the other end of the machine. So, so anyway, sometimes the bureaucracy, the technology makes life harder. Another example is, in big bureaucratic institutions, we sort of dehumanize each other. We think of each other as objects rather than people. And I ran into this example of this several years ago. It was during registration, and I was doing advising. I had at that time probably 150 advisees who needed my signature to get in their classes. And so they're lined up down the hall to see me. And they come in, and I hardly even look up. I just say, what do you want to take? Why do you want to take it? I look over the list. If it looks appropriate, I say fine. If not, I say, have you thought about this? You need to do this. And then next, and we just run through. And I look up at one point, and there's a woman standing there who happens to be a good friend of mine. We go to church together, and I've been in her home, and she and her husband have been in our home many times. And I said, well, Sharon, what are you doing here? And she said, well, I'm thinking about coming back to school and getting my degree. And I said, well, great. Tell me what your goals are. Let's talk about this. Would you like a cup of coffee? And I found myself treating her completely differently because she's a person, not just an advisee, not just one of the people herding through. And so when we do things in mass numbers, it tends to dehumanize the process. And that can make life worse instead of better. There's a fellow named Martin Buber, a Jewish theologian philosopher, who described human relationships as I-thou relationships or I-it relationships. An I-it relationship is when you treat the other person as an object to be manipulated for your purposes. In an I-thou relationship, you recognize that that person is a person, unique in the world, with their own values, their own priorities, their own agendas, and you respect that their agendas are just as important as yours. So from his view, I-it relationships are really an abuse of humanity, and I-thou relationships are what it's all about. But having those kinds of I-thou relationships where we remember the uniqueness of the other person, we respect their identity, is hard to do when you do things in mass. When you have 150 advisees, or you got 80 students in a class, or if you're in a high school and you've got 6 classes a day with 30 different students coming through, that does not encourage you to see them and interact with them as human beings. It encourages you to treat them as objects and manipulate them for your own purposes. And just the whole idea of public education ties into that. Think about the fact that many of our schools have goals like we want to raise our standardized test scores. So our goal is to raise this score, and the students are objects to be manipulated to help us reach that. Oh, we're not concerned about what their goals are. The curriculum is not designed to serve their goals. We don't go in there and say, what do you guys want to learn this semester? This is all determined by somebody else, and it's imposed on them in a mass way, and our job is to manipulate them to make it happen. And so this whole idea of bureaucratically based education is fundamentally contrary to the ideals of existential thought. I'm going to stop right there for video 1 and start with video 2. You can find it on the same place where you found this one.